Good evening, everybody. Well, good afternoon and good evening, depending where you are. Welcome to a form of Warpstock Europe I'm not used to, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we decided to a virtual Warpstock Europe this year. Um, you shouldn't have any difficulty viewing the video stream, as this is coming from my apartment in Nijkerk in the Netherlands, where we've got a 50 megabit fiber optic connection. In other words, it should be more than sufficient to get the video stream stable outdoor towards YouTube. Um, and there is no Wi-Fi being used, it's all wired. So in other words, the video stream must work. You can see the schedule on warpstock.eu with the take into account the different time zones. Oh, there's a complaint here that the sound volume is a bit low. Oh. One moment. You will notice that there's going to be a slight delay because the audio is buffered by YouTube. I pushed my microphone a bit higher, so hopefully people can hear me better. Some presentations are pre-recorded. The presenters, however, will be present later at the end of the presentation so that you can ask any questions via IRC. I'm also got a laptop here next to me where I'm logged into the YouTube channel, so people can ask questions there as well. And then later the presenters can answer any questions that you have. We have the presentations spread out over 2 days. We did that to accommodate the time zone differences. Some people that live in Japan can just pick up the presentations right now, a portion of them, before it gets late into the night. So can you please go to the next slide? Okay, well, a portion of the stuff that you've heard last year, Voice has continued to work on this year. The help desk tool from Rich Walsh has proven helpful to help some OS2 users. I've used it myself. I know that Neil Waldhauer from California, blonde guy, has actually used it to help a Warp 4 customer. So that's pretty cool. The tool is working as designed, as in it works on every OS2 version without any additional software. Our push to get OS2 Voice more present on social media continues to move forward. We are present on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and we've also, since this year, have an active Google page that if you bump into the Voice Google page, that the news items will be posted there. This is all part of the ongoing effort to distribute current OS2 news on different social media platforms. I know it's better to interact with people there, but I don't have the time for it. As a side note, Ian Manners from Australia had continuous problems with his ISP to host his OS2 archive, os2site.com. As of approximately 2 months, that's now running on a hosted web server that Voice rents, and it's connected to Amsterdam Internet Exchange, so that should be quickly accessible for everybody. We're working with Ian to set up so that he from home can update the files on the site, and that's another service that OS2 Voice is now providing to the community. rpmos2voice.org, while you haven't seen anything there yet, it's still in the works, and I'm finally hoping that after some of the other stuff that has been keeping me really occupied, I finally have some more time to work on it. And I just remember that I didn't mention something that was on the first slide. Anybody looking at the presentation schedule will notice that it's pretty empty. The organization team, well, which is effectively me each year. I've been hit by a mild form, most likely of COVID-19, and I've been out of order, to put it like that, for the month April. So the time I wanted to spend working on Warpstock has been pretty limited. I haven't had any serious side effects, but I've been pretty dead tired. So anyway, moving along. Can you move to the next slide, please? This is one of the projects that has been eating up a lot of my time, getting a sufficient amount of funding collected to keep the development going for a new browser. Either Sylvan Scherer or Dmitry Konnikov will tomorrow give a oh, and I'm here, on one moment, I'm seeing here from a note on the IRC channel from Mr. Faulty that he doesn't see the slides. That should be fixed. Thanks for the note. That should be fixed now. This is, some people that have noticed, this presentation has some similarities with the presentation from last year. Firefox and the Mozilla platform OS2 are running on its last legs, and it has taken up quite a lot of my spare time to continue to collect funding for Bitwise Works for ongoing development. The bottom line is that for large projects, our community simply needs a developer that's working on large projects, as for example, porting Qt to OS2. It's getting really close now. Qt has been ported for some time. People that looked at Warpstock US last year in Florida, Greg Young gave a presentation about Qt application being compiled on OS2. So the Qt framework is there. The major stumbling block is the WebKit DLL. And I did talk to Dmitry today. There are some issues that they have encountered getting the WebKit DLL, which is the last big puzzle piece of this whole big contraption called the Chromium engine, to get that to compile on OS2. And as Dmitry will emphasize tomorrow in his presentation, developing code on OS2 is not plug and play as it is on Linux or other major platforms. We are continuously being plagued as a community by software which is outdated developer tools and libraries, and there is one person working on it. So it's quite a journey for him alone to get all of that stuff done. There is some help, but we will give you more information on that tomorrow. As a last point, yes, I do hear people say, what if Bitwise Works doesn't make it with this browser? I have a very simple and very straightforward answer to this. It's 2020, and who would have thought that we would have seen OS2 running on a UEFI-based system? If you would have told me 10 years ago, I would have simply laughed you out straight in the face, not thinking it's possible. But as you can see with the next presentation from Alex Taylor, UEFI for OS2 is there, and it's working to a very large extent, and it has been tested on a lot of equipment. Is it ready for prime time? No, but the level of functionality is certainly impressive if you consider that we're talking here about a 30-year-old operating system, and that ArcaOS has been able to push a UEFI loader with all of the other components into the OS. It's nothing short of impressive. And somebody is again asking that my volume is too low. Can you raise the microphone? No, that's it. I'm sorry, I'm already talking louder. Can you move to the next slide, please? So as for the future for OS2, I always give a forward-looking statement. Yeah, using OS2 can sometimes not be easy, but I have no plans of shutting down OS2 voice anytime soon. I'm enjoying it, and I'm enjoying it working with the community. Warpstock Europe 2021 will most likely occur in the third May of week in Frankfurt. So we will have a physical Warpstock again, but that of course all depends on the development on COVID-19. Looking at all of the medical research that's being done, things are hopeful. So there are about 500 clinical trials right now. So we hope that there's going to be a treatment for this soon, as we're all seriously affected by that, by the COVID-19 crisis. ArcaOS is viable. A new browser is coming. We're very close. I know you've heard that before, but the presentation from Dimitri will explain in more detail what type of stumbling blocks you encounter. And yes, with good project management, you cannot figure it all out. There's one person doing the development, and that's a big achievement. UEFI for ArcaOS is coming. In fact, I've already seen the presentation video, which you will be able to see within about 20 minutes. And it's pretty darn impressive, as we've got a more or less functional operating system. I've also seen that USB 3.0 will contain the long-awaited USB 3.0 support or XHCI support, but more details will be in the presentations of Louis Rosenthal, his presentation from ArcNoa tomorrow. And then of course there's the other thing. What other projects would we like to see occur for the community? Smaller ones, but also big ones. Some people want to have a new Java version on OS2, but the voice organization is getting very limited to zero feedback what people want. So the Voice Foundation is there to look what the community wants, and then we can set up potentially a funding campaign to move the projects forward. My slides are gone on my screen. Can you put them? I think you. Can you go to the next slide, please? So, as I ask each year, is there anybody that wants to write a report about Warpstock Europe? There is a new page that's been active for a couple of years, which is called articles.os2voice.org. But so far, I'm the only sole publisher on that platform. The reason that we put it up was that the old newsletter was pretty time consuming for an editor to arrange the whole layout of an article he wanted to publish. But now you can do that in a WYSIWYG editor, so you don't have to have any knowledge of HTML layout, and you can just upload a picture and put it in there and write something. I'm certain that there must be some people that are thrilled by now to finally start writing an article, because currently it's just me. And of course, we continue to need your sponsorship. We're trying to do everything we can with every penny we get to spend it on active development. We also have a sponsor unit for the video stream. And is there anything that you want to have ported to OS2? Let us know. I've emphasized the work that Bitwise Works is doing. One of the things that is considered currently is that there is a strong impression that a lot of people are downloading the software from Bitwise Works and the NetLabs repository free of charge and are not making a donation. It's a free world. We can't force you to make a donation, but there is a very big chance that the new browser will be available in some limited form. Current considerations, and this is subject to change, is that the browser will be made available with a default homepage pointing out that you will need to make a donation for that default web page to disappear. Other options being considered is that updates are delayed, be distributed to the community free of charge by half year. And you can only support bugs if you make a donation. All of these things are currently under consideration, but the model distributed free of charge, all the software is no longer maintainable. We feel it's simply not honest to the people that have made donations, while other people receive the benefits of that and do not contribute. So that's one of the things that's currently under consideration. More details will follow. So what I said, this is just a thought that we are having, but we need to increase the funding stream so that work can continue to update this new browser, but also for future plans. So like, for example, new Java version. We will say that the people that have donated up to a certain level, and we're still determining that level, will get access to the new browser features, of course, free of charge. The people that have donated, we have a list of that and the amount that we donated, and we'll certainly take that into account. So it's kind of like the open office model that BitwiseWorks has. You can receive an updated version when you give a donation to BitwiseWorks, and then you get access to the download and get access to support. But the model that we're considering is to basically have a kind of a shareware version of the browser, binaries available. And if you want to have more, then you need to make a donation. Of course, the sources, as under the license required, will be available to anybody at all time. So that kind of wraps up my voice presentation. I'm looking here at both my screens to see if there are any questions, but I don't think that there is. Are there any questions? I think there's some delay on the video stream before people actually see it, which is about 20 to 30 seconds, so I'll just wait for that. And if there are no questions in about a minute time, then I will discontinue the stream, put it on pause, and then we will continue in about 12 minutes with Alex Taylor, his pre-recorded session with a UEFI demo. And I'm just looking again if there are any questions here. Anybody? One moment, let me type something here on the IRC channel. Any questions? Okay, well, this is the first time I'm doing a digital Warpstock, so yeah, it was a bit of improvisation. I do see that I get feedback that the video stream is pretty stable, so that seems to be working. So we'll be back, as they say on television, we'll be right back after these messages. We'll now switch over to the pre-recorded presentation from Alex Taylor. That will take about 40 to 45 minutes. Please make any notes for questions that you have. And after this presentation, we will bring in Alex via Skype, and then you can ask questions at the end of the presentation. That way I can also read any questions after the presentation, and then Alex can answer them so that they'll end up in the video stream for anybody that views this video after Warpstock Europe is over. Okay, can you please start the presentation?
As some of you may recall, last year I talked about ArcaOS plans for enabling support for UEFI in ArcaOS. I also gave a brief demonstration of a technology proof of concept. So now I'm going to give an update on the state of this project, and as you'll see, it's come a long way in the past year. Now, what is UEFI? Just to recap, it stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, and it's essentially the next generation for BIOS. So it eliminates many of the shortcomings of so-called legacy BIOS, and it provides various modern features, which is good. But on the flip side, it no longer provides the old-style access to the hardware level for operating systems that the old-style BIOS provided. Now, UEFI has been in the works for many years. Until now, however, most implementations of UEFI have been providing a BIOS backwards compatibility layer via something called a Compatibility Support Module, or CSM. And this has allowed operating systems like OS2 and others which don't support UEFI to continue to use the the legacy BIOS interface through the CSM to operate the hardware. However, manufacturers are now, as of 2020, starting to phase out support for this CSM, which means increasingly from this point on, new computer hardware is going to be UEFI, that is pure UEFI only. And anything that tries to go through BIOS interfaces, legacy BIOS interfaces, is not going to work. Meaning that once this CSM support is gone, operating systems which require the old BIOS interface are not going to function on modern hardware anymore. Now, fortunately, in the case of OS2, the operating system only depends on the BIOS interface for a few specific things. This is in contrast to DOS, which heavily uses the BIOS for almost all hardware interaction, as I understand. But OS2 only needs it for the initial boot, that is to say, to operate the hardware up to the point where OS2 device drivers are loaded, at which point those OS2 drivers will take over. And once the system is booted, two main interfaces through the BIOS that OS2 normally continues to use. Those are the int10 interface, which provides access to the VGA hardware. And this is required, among other things, for full-screen DOS sessions. And one of the other interfaces that it continues to use is int13 under some circumstances. Int13 is generic hard disk or fixed disk I/O. This is not normally what the storage drivers that operate hard disks under OS2 use, but it does sometimes get used, for example, as a fallback if OS2 can't locate any proper driver for the hard disk controller. It provides a generic int13 driver which can be used instead and has terrible performance. But I think the int13 interface is also used in a few other circumstances, and in particular for taking trap dumps. Because when the system is in a ring 0 trap, there are no more driver interfaces available, so it has to use the BIOS access to write directly to the hard disk via int13. So that's using the standard traditional BIOS interface. Now, to implement UEFI support in ArcaOS, obviously we're going to have to figure out replacements or workarounds for these various issues. So, in designing the UEFI support in ArcaOS, we've essentially identified four main areas that need to be solved, basically. And these are, first, and most simply, to be able to boot, install, and run ArcaOS on pure UEFI hardware. That is to say, a system without a BIOS interface, either traditional or through a CSM. Second, high-resolution video support, which basically means, you can load the Panorama or JNGrad or whatever video driver, and you can get, resolutions that are better than basic VGA, for example, 1920 by 1080 or 1024 by 768 or any of those. So that's all stuff that needs to be addressed because we can't access the video BIOS anymore to get the resolutions that it believes that it supports. The third area is memory dump support, and I touched on that a moment ago. And the fourth one, is full screen DOS and WinOS 2 support. So I'll go through a little of these in a bit more detail. But first of all, what is the status of each of these items in the current state of UEFI development? So we've been working on this for over a year now, and we've actually come a long way to supporting these items in ArcaOS, and let's go through them now. So, to boot, install, and run ArcaOS on pure UEFI hardware is working. To support decent video resolutions on a pure UEFI system is working. To support memory dumps, that is to say ring zero trap dumps, is working. Full screen, DOS, and WinOS 2 support is partially working now, and it is making rapid progress even as we speak. So, let's go through those items in a little more detail. Now, the first one was booting and running ArcaOS. So, how do you boot a UEFI system? Well, UEFI defines a system partition which essentially contains a standardized boot manager interface. So UEFI has an actual standard for how a boot manager is implemented and works. And ArcaOS's UEFI support integrates a boot menu which presents the available options on a UEFI system. Now, obviously, you need to be able to actually boot the operating system once you've selected it from the boot menu. So the next piece is an EFI-enabled OS2 loader. Now this is capable of booting ArcaOS, that is to say the OS2 core system files, kernel, device drivers, and so on, from a hard disk in UEFI mode, as long as the hard disk is formatted according to the MBR formatting standard for now. Now, this EFI OS2 loader uses UEFI disk services. It does not use the In13 that I was talking about earlier. So it is able to use the pure UEFI disk services to load the system files. And in order to keep certain device drivers happy, because they think that they are loading a BIOS, this OS2 loader actually implements a minimal BIOS interface which certain drivers can access and get information back through UEFI, but they don't know they're getting it through UEFI. As far as some of these drivers are concerned, they think they're still getting the information from an actual BIOS, whereas now they're not. This information includes ACPI tables, int10, the VGA interface information about the VESA BIOS video, and so on. But what this means is that with this interface and this OS2 loader, OS2 drivers can essentially load without any modification in the UEFI environment. So this is essential. It means we don't have to do any heavy modifying of the operating system. We just provide this extra piece at the very start of system boot, at the very lowest level, that provides this compatible interface, and then the system continues to function as it always has, with obviously a few minor caveats, which will become more clear as we go on. Another critical piece here is called BVH-EFI.dll. And this is a replacement for a system DLL called BVH-VGA.dll. This is essentially the video hardware interface that the system uses. And so what BVH-EFI.dll does in replacing this module is it allows the operating system to handle not having that VGA hardware interface through int 10 and so on. So with BVH-EFI.dll, video support works properly under the UEFI environment. And speaking of video support, the high resolution, that is, when I say high resolution, I mean anything above like basic 640 by 480 VGA. Now, at the moment, this is set at boot time. If you have, or if you recall seeing the early proof of concept that I showed last year, that was actually a menu option when we started booting the UEFI loader that actually asked you, okay, what is your video resolution? So the resolution is actually set at boot time. You choose, or determine, I should say, one resolution, and that is what the operating system uses from boot onward. So you can select this from a menu, you can set this in a configuration file, and we may be looking at slightly more convenient ways of getting this set as we make the system a little more integrated. But the upshot is we have support for a high resolution that is presented to the video driver, such as Panorama, and it just works without any changes needed to that video driver, such as Panorama. And also Dive, which is the video support extensions, motion video, that also works without any changes needed. And you'll see an example of that when I do a demonstration. Okay, the next item I mentioned was memory dump support. And memory dumps, as you may be aware, are used for critical error analysis and debugging. And you can set your system up on a standard default install. These aren't normally enabled, but you can quite easily set it up to take a system dump when a ring 0 trap occurs. You can also generate them on demand. And if you're working on device driver development, or if you're working through support channels for somebody who needs these system dumps, you can take these dumps and either use them to analyze very low level, to do very low level tracing to analyze what a problem might be, or you can send them to the support person who requested them, and they can do that. Now, OS2 has obviously supported this for years and years. Up until now, though, it's been a bit awkward because you've needed to create a FAT16 partition to store these dump files, and FAT16 only supports up to 2 gigabyte partition sizes, which means if you have more than 2 gigabytes of memory, you can't actually take a memory dump without jumping through some hoops, which I won't go into. But with the UEFI project, we now have a new OS2 dump. This is working already, and it actually works on non-UEFI systems too. But the great thing about this one is that int13 is not required. It also supports dump files of larger than 2 gigabytes, and you don't need to do awkward things like artificially limit your memory size or use a special dumpfs file system. So this is pretty seamless and pretty convenient. So we can now get memory dumps of very large RAM sizes, and we don't need the BIOS interface in 13 to actually write them to disk anymore. And the last major area I mentioned was DOS and WinOS2 support. Now this presents a bit more of a challenge because DOS and WinOS2, which runs on top of DOS, as I mentioned at the beginning, DOS traditionally has made much heavier use of the standard BIOS interfaces for hardware support. Now, the OS2 DOS box obviously goes through the OS2 operating system level more than it actually talks to the real BIOS, but there are still certain areas in which it does actually talk to the BIOS. So to get DOS support working, we've had to implement some more extensive replacement of BIOS interfaces than were required for the basic operating system. So we've introduced a new device driver called VEFI.sys, and this replaces the DOS video driver VSVGA.sys. And it does a number of things, does a number of actually very clever things, but on a high level, it eliminates the dependency on real legacy BIOS, and it eliminates the dependency on having to talk to legacy VGA hardware. And this has been a challenge not only in getting UEFI working. A lot of modern systems, as some of you have probably noticed, have idiosyncratic VGA hardware compatibility. And this has led to situations, especially with OS2, where DOS full-screen sessions or DOS windowed sessions, or one or the other or both, has weird video compatibility issues where it can't switch to that video mode, or it can, but it doesn't really work properly. And there are various workarounds that have been sort of talked about, and they don't all work in all cases. But with VEFI.sys and this essentially replacing the whole interface to the legacy VGA hardware, this has the potential to completely eliminate all of these video compatibility issues with DOS sessions on modern systems. So that just underscores again how important UEFI is for the future of this platform. Because not only are we continuing the viability of this platform on modern hardware, we have the potential to actually address nagging problems that have been slowly building over time with other aspects of the system, like DOS boxes and video modes. So, as to where we are right now, I said this was partially working, and it is. So at the moment that I'm speaking now, DOS windows are working, DOS windowed sessions. Seamless WinOS2 sessions are working. Full-screen WinOS2 sessions are largely working, and support for full-screen DOS sessions is in progress. And if I sound a bit hesitant when I mention those last two, it's because the developer is working so fast and so productively on this that I wrote those last two bullet points, and then literally this morning I was told, oh, by the way, we've actually got full screen sessions much closer to working now. So maybe this will all be working much sooner than even I expect. It's really quite impressive how quickly this stuff is moving along. So, speaking of which, what is next in our roadmap for UEFI support? Well, since it's the major thing that's sort of still outstanding, first on the list is finishing full-screen DOS support, and as well making sure that any compatibility issues with DOS and Windows 2 sessions in particular are ironed out. A couple of other things that aren't quite there yet. The Alt F1 recovery menu, we don't really have full support for that just yet. I mean, there are ways that we can kind of do boot time recovery. There are special system options in the UEFI loader, but it's not quite the same as the traditional Alt F1 recovery menu. So for support purposes and compatibility purposes, it's on our agenda to get that going. Boot logo. when you see this in action, one thing you will notice is that we don't have a boot logo at the moment, and that's because we don't have access under UEFI to the VGA, to the hardware VGA support that the boot logo normally uses. So that's going to have to be implemented, and that's, I mean, it's on the agenda. Obviously, the DOS support and so on is a bit higher priority, but we'll get there, I'm sure. Support for more fonts in various different video settings, sort of things like having different text sizes, I think, in different command prompt or text mode sessions. Not totally sure exactly where that is at the moment, but I've heard some discussion on the development channel about maybe looking at that. And as well, this last one I have highlighted because this is probably the single biggest piece that's still kind of on the horizon. GPT disk support. Now, as I said, all of this works fine. You can install to a hard disk, a fixed disk that uses the MBR, that is the traditional partitioning scheme. The GPT partitioning scheme is becoming more common on modern systems, and it's actually quite closely tied to UEFI. Technically, UEFI doesn't mandate the use of GPT. It is, like the standard does say, that it should support either GPT or MBR disks. As is the case with many standards on paper, this is not always as true as we might like. And also, if you're dealing with a system which already has an operating system installed on it, chances are it is going to be GPT formatted, and yeah, in that case, you're in a bit of difficulty unless you can put in a second hard disk that's MBR. But, you know, these are all just things that we will get to. The fact that we have managed to get this far in really a little over a year of development is nothing short of amazing. So I have confidence that everything that's on this list, we'll get there in time. All right. Now, before I take questions, I think we are going to do a demonstration of actually installing ArcaOS on a UEFI system. And this is what you all want to see, right? So, this is, I mean, fair disclosure, this demonstration is pre-recorded because I wasn't going to make you all sit here while it goes through the, 5% installed, 6% installed, and so on. So I'm going to cut away and show you the demonstration of installing on UEFI hardware. Stay tuned. Okay, so let's install ArcaOS on a pure UEFI environment. Now the first thing we're going to do when we power this on is go into the BIOS and make sure that it is set to UEFI mode only. That's so that we know that there is no BIOS compatibility in this system, so we can prove that this is indeed running UEFI. So we go into this particular computer's BIOS, we find the option for boot mode. Notice there is legacy BIOS and UEFI as the options, but we make sure that it is set to UEFI. So this is now in pure UEFI mode. We save that and boot it up again, and we've already got the ArcaOS UEFI DVD inserted. So here we see the usual menu where you can set up the system, and it looks very familiar. Notice it does say UEFI at the bottom and in the middle of the screen. So this is just to show you that yes, this is a UEFI mode boot. So we don't really have to change anything here. This is just to show you what it looks like. It looks basically the same as ever. So we proceed with the boot, and as you can see, this is where the boot logo would normally appear, but we don't actually have a boot logo yet. And now the drivers load as they usually do, and this should all look very familiar because at this point this is all just the standard operating system. The UEFI layer has loaded, it's in place, it's providing that compatibility layer to everything else, and everything else just sees this as a normal system from this point on. So this and the next few steps will look very familiar. So just let it finish booting up here. Okay, we've got the workplace shell, or at least presentation manager, starting, and the ArcaOS installer is right there. And again, even though we are booted in UEFI mode, it's the same ArcaOS installer, looks the same, works the same license agreement. Please read it. And you just go through. Now, there is a slightly different bit of work here in the sense that you have to create, and you'll see it in a second, we have to create a special UEFI system partition. It's called the EFI partition, and this is essentially what contains the standard UEFI boot files and boot menu and various other things. So every UEFI system needs this special EFI partition. This is just checking the disk integrity here. Takes a few moments as always. So we don't see any target volume because we have to set that up. So we've got a blank disk. So first thing we're going to do is create the EFI system partition. And if you don't do this, it will remind you when you try to finish here. It'll say, hey, you need an EFI system partition. And you only need one, by the way. If you already have a hard disk with this system partition on it, you don't need to create a new one. So save that, and oops, shouldn't have exited there. Okay, so at this point we can just create the new volume. Next, all of the usual stuff here. And, probably shouldn't normally use such a big partition, but whatever. This is just a demonstration. So we've got a 100 plus gig partition, which will take a while to format, but never mind. So again, we just go through. We've got the usual hardware options here. I don't think there's anything special here, so we just go through, yes, next, and that is basically it as far as the first phase of the install. I mean, other than that step where you have to create the EFI system partition, it's just the same as any other ArcaOS installation. And as I say, when you only have to create that EFI system partition if your hard disk does not already have one. So you can go into the menu there, create it, or it should actually, if you don't remember to create it explicitly, when you set up the volume, it'll actually tell you, by the way, we need an EFI system partition. Would you like me to create one for you now, if there isn't one already? So it's pretty easy. Nothing especially fancy to it, and at this point I'm really just filling up time. As we all know, this kind of takes a while, so what I think I will actually do is pause the recording here and skip ahead a bit to the next boot. Okay, we're back here, just finishing the end of the first phase. So the system's going to reboot. And as I've been saying, this basically just looks the same as any other ArcaOS install for the most part. So yeah, system boots, you get the menu, you can just let it boot from the hard disk. And I just hit enter there. That what you just saw there was the EFI boot menu that we have implemented. So it shows you what the various EFI operating systems on all of the hard disks are. I just skip past it because you can't really see it very clearly in this camera setup. But so yeah, the system is now booting from the hard disk. And this is actually the big new thing since our demonstration last year. If you saw last year's demonstration, you'll recall we booted from, I think, a USB stick. Didn't actually touch the hard disk. But at this point, we have booted ArcaOS in UEFI mode off the hard disk. Just think about that milestone for a second. A year ago, we were saying, well, this is something that we hope we can do at some point. We're there. So I showed you on the slide. Install and boot and run ArcaOS. It's working now. So I think that's very impressive. And I get to say that because I'm not the actual main developer of this, so I can gush about how impressive it is. So anyway, yeah, this is again back to the standard install procedure for ArcaOS, and as I'm sure many of you know, this takes a while, so I'm going to kind of pause it again and come back to you when we're ready to look at the final system. Okay, so the second phase of the installation is done here. We're just ready to reboot and see what the final system looks like. And it should look pretty much like a standard ArcaOS system, because that's what it is. It's just in a UEFI environment. So here we go one more time. Booting up. Just skip past the CD boot menu there. Skip past the boot manager. Yeah, you see again, no OS2 logo just yet. That's still on our to-do list. So it's doing the final few pieces, and in any moment now we will have the final desktop. And here it is, a fully installed ArcaOS system on UEFI hardware. And it should look and function just the same as any other ArcaOS systems. At least that's the ideal. As I say, we're still ironing out some of the final bits of the DOS support and so on. But just clicking around a bit randomly here, so you can see all the USB drivers are loaded. Oh yeah, you can see there's an XHCI driver, which is something a lot of people have been looking forward to. I won't linger on that, because I don't want to preempt Lewis and his discussion of such. So what we're going to do now is pause again, and the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to actually set up some software on this system, like Windows software and so on, so that I can give you a proper demonstration of how some of it works, just to show you that it does work. So I need to set that software up first, and I'm not going to make you sit through all of my fiddling around. So I'm just going to pause now and be back here in a second. Okay, so we're back, and again we've got the ArcaOS desktop here. I'm just going to look at the screen object so you can see what resolution we're running under. So Panorama is working, and it's not just Panorama, by the way. Video support, like Dive video support, is working too. So just give you a quick demonstration of that. So yeah, here's a video which is using the Dive video API. That works fine. Yeah. What does that remind me of? Video always reminds me of something. Oh well. Anyway, next let's take a look at some command prompts. So we've got the whole collection in here. Yeah, why not? WinOS 2. So, Windows 2 full screen session. So this is actually working, and we've installed a bunch of software here. So, Star Office is an old Office suite that some of you may have heard of, predecessor of OpenOffice, and yeah, I mean, what can I say? It's running, it's working, looks the same as it always does. So, a few other things going on here. Let's take a look at the write program. Yay, I mean, not exactly high-class software, but it's working, and that's the important thing. So let's get out of this, and next, so that was the full screen. Let's take a look at Seamless. And the window resizing is always a bit awkward when you do this. So again, we've got the same WinOS 2, but this time running seamlessly. So it just proves that the full screen and seamless sessions both working fine. So you don't really need to see more of WinOS 2. I know it's so beautiful. So DOS is the next bit, and DOS windowed sessions. Notice that we don't get any nasty little comments like system does not support this video mode in a window. No, we have a working window, and DOS and full screen. Well, this one is still a bit of a work in progress. I believe this much was, I think, just got working within the last few days, in fact. So I won't go too far into that because it's not really much to see. But as you can see, you can run the sessions; they work. Here's OS2 full screen. Window full screen here. Yeah. As I say, it's not really a lot to show you, but it's all there. It's all working, and I have to say, the fact that it is not very exciting to look at is what makes it exciting, because it just works, no drama. And that, my friends, would seem to be that. So, at this point, I think we can take your questions, and please go easy on me. I know a bit about this stuff, but I'm not the primary developer, so super technical questions I might not be able to answer all that well, but I'll do my best.
Switch on there. Okay, sorry. I have Alex patched in via Skype. I think you can hear him as well. So I think everybody will agree that this is pretty impressive. I understood that there are still some things with UEFI outstanding, but again, as I've always said, when I still worked at Menzies on Ecom Station, with OS2 the changes are always under the bonnet, which is pretty boring to look at. Just the mere fact that a 30-year-old OS can boot on modern hardware is well, it's bizarre to see it, but it works. So, and as you saw, the level of functionality is just about equal as to a normal OS2 version. So that's quite an achievement. Now Alex is patched in, and I don't know if there are any other questions that people have about this UEFI demo that was made. Or everybody takes this for granted and everybody accepts this and then we'll move over to the next presentation. I don't know. So let me open the floor for questions. I'm looking at the IRC channel right now. As I said, there's about a 30-second delay before you hear me. So I'm waiting to see if people give any questions. Let's see here. Let me also switch to the no, okay. I'm also looking at the YouTube video stream to see if there are any questions. So, and I'm not going to wait too long. So I think by now everybody should have heard. they have any questions that they can now ask or forever should be silent.
There's a couple of questions in the IRC, I think.
Yeah, there's one there that works with secure boot.
No, basically, at least there's no technical reason why it wouldn't, but secure boot, you need basically some sort of license certificate that has to be signed by Microsoft to get that to work. And I'm sure it's there for the buying if and when it's deemed ready to go and request one. But it's a tricky process, and it takes time and money to go through that. So at the moment, we don't work with secure boot enabled, but that's something to look at down the road. Martin's asking about availability date. I see Lewis picked that up. So yeah, this is in the plans for the 5.1 feature list. So not the next minor refresh, but hopefully not too far into the future. A little earlier, back up a little, there was a question about Snap video, a question about the EFI partition. I answered those in the chat. Just to kind of recap, this is working with the generic GRAD and Panorama. At the moment, I believe it hasn't been made to work fully with Snap yet. That's just something that needs to be done still. Snap has a bit more hardware interdependency than the more generic Panorama, which is, I assume, why. EFI partition, is that a kind of boot manager thing? Sort of. It does a bit more than that. I probably am not the person to ask about the technical details of what the EFI partition really does, but basically any hard disk, well, to boot off any disk that uses UEFI, you need to have an EFI system partition, which contains basically all of the bootloaders for each of the UEFI operating systems on the system. The kind of nifty thing about it is it doesn't have to be on the hard disk. Technically, you can have the EFI partition on the CD or even USB stick or something, but obviously you're going to want it on the hard disk so that you don't have to keep a boot CD installed all the time. So to put it very simply, yeah, it is kind of like a boot manager thingy, but it does do more than that. Yeah, any more questions about the UEFI stuff?
Yeah, and I saw a question about availability. I guess also the implementation of GPT is going to be a pretty big amount of work.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that could be approached, and the exact approach to take is still kind of under discussion. I think the consensus on our end is it's doable. We just need to work out which particular strategy to go with. And I get the impression, again, I'm not really in on the technical details of some of this stuff. I get the impression there are different considerations, different trade-offs, depending on which method you go with. But as I said in the presentation, this should all be doable. I'm sure we'll get there.
If you guys can do UEFI support, why is GPT not doable?
Well, exactly. Yeah. And our developer is very clever. I have to say that.
There's another question here about the EFI partition that do Windows and Linux also use one? Yes, they also use one. In fact, I've also worked with Windows UEFI installations at work. And basically both on a GPT disk layout and on an ArcaOS MBR UEFI boot, you both have basically a system partition. And as Alex has highlighted, yes, that's effectively a kind of rudimentary replacement for what you could call the boot manager. the EFI loader files reside on those disks. So if you install, for example, Windows and ArcaOS on a system in the future, that system partition will contain the EFI loader that the EFI firmware will load from that partition. In other words, the UEFI firmware will look at that partition to see which EFI loaders are then present. And in most systems in the BIOS, you can specify which EFI file it has to load by default to boot from. So EFI systems also have kind of a built-in boot manager in the menu compared to how the old MBR boot method used to work.
Yeah, so jumping in on that, to sort of directly address the question, there were actually two questions, one in the video stream, one in the IRC. So yeah, a system which has UEFI operating systems on it has one EFI partition, which is shared by all EFI operating systems. So if you already have an EFI OS, a UEFI operating system installed, that will have already, you will already have an EFI system partition on there. You don't need to create another one in that case. Of course, there is still the caveat that in most cases you won't have other UEFI operating systems on the hard disk, because at the moment the hard disk is going to be MBR, at least in this kind of development phase. So until we have GPT, it's very, very likely that you're probably not going to be having multiple like Windows and ArcaOS on the same system. Well, I suppose if you install separate hard drives, you could do that. So even then, speaking of which, can a system on a second hard disk be booted from an EFI partition on the first hard disk? Yes, that's my understanding. In fact, one thing that we noticed, I noticed when I was testing some of the early releases and helping integrate the ArcaOS installer was there is an EFI, essentially an EFI boot image, of a kind of EFI partition on the ArcaOS install DVD, and you can use that as the EFI system partition. So technically, you don't need one on the hard disk if you have the ArcaOS install DVD installed, and it made testing actually a little more complicated, because sometimes when I was trying to make sure that I created the EFI partition, I thought I had, but it turned out that I hadn't, because I was picking up the one off the DVD and it looks exactly the same. So I didn't discover that I'd forgotten to do that until I took the DVD out. But yeah, so one EFI partition in the system will take care of all the EFI OSs that are installed, whatever disk it's on. If you have multiple OSs, if you have multiple OSs, do you need a bigger EFI partition? I'm not actually sure. Maybe in theory, but I would imagine in most cases the EFI partition that's created by default is going to be big enough for most operating systems. I mean, it only has to have a very limited collection of boot files on it, so it's not as if it has to be big, even if you have several OSs on it. And frankly, the minimum partition size on a modern hard disk, at least that our partitioning tools are liable to create, is probably going to be plenty big enough. So yeah.
I think the EFI files on a Windows EFI partitioning or USB stick, I think it's about 500 kilobytes. So if you add the ArcaOS ones to it, you're down to less than a megabyte in size. So you can probably stash a whole bunch of OSs on a single UEFI system partition.
Yeah, I forget how big the one that we try to create by default is. I think it's like at least 7 megabytes or something. So not likely to run out of space, even if you have half a dozen operating systems on there.
Are there any other questions there? I'm just looking to see if there's anything here on the YouTube channel. I think there are no.
Anything newer that may replace UEFI in the future? I hope not. Nothing in the pipe that I'm aware of. I mean, UEFI is still being phased in, so it's
If people want to see details, then they can just look at uefi.org. You can see all of the spec files there. I think the current UEFI specs cover the base specifications about 1600 pages, and UEFI has been planned for the last 10 years already. And there seems to be no end that they are going to replace UEFI anytime soon. So no, it's not going to be replaced. There's nothing new on the horizon that we are aware of.
Okay, another question here, David. So in standard multi-boot environment, it's required to create partitions with the LVM. What about UEFI? Again, it's the same hard disk partitioning scheme, so the same basically restrictions apply to that. So you are strongly advised to use LVM or compatible tools to create your partitions. If you don't, we've got the disk checker should, like the disk utility should be able to cope with that. And I see you have another question about that in a second. I'll get to that. But I mean, not necessarily LVM specifically that you have to use to create partitions, but you do need to either create partitions or use something to fix up the partition tables that uses cylinder boundaries to lay them out. We don't. The logical volume manager in ArcaOS does not support sector boundary partitioning. So regarding the next question about the disk utility, is it ready for UEFI partition resizing? I mean, UEFI partition is like there isn't really such a thing. It's either MBR partitioning or GPT partitioning. MBR partitioning, it's the same as before. It's the same partitioning scheme again. If and when GPT comes into play, supposedly, I mean, I suppose that the utilities such as the disk utility will be updated for that. I mean, the disk utility uses the DFC engine on the back end, and DFC is already pretty capable with regards to a lot of these partitioning schemes. So I don't know, if you really want to dig into that, you might ask Jan. I believe he's got a presentation coming up later. But as far as that goes, I mean, yeah, it's the partitioning situation is the same as it has been.
Well, I think in my Mensis days I already looked at GPT support, and I think that most questions regarding MBR boot and UEFI and what the current tools do are very premature in the sense that, as you said, even though the UEFI specs allow for an MBR UEFI hard disk boot, practically speaking, usability just about zero. If you try to boot Windows 10 on a hard disk in UEFI mode and it sees an MBR disk, it will flat out refuse you to install to an MBR based disk. So yeah, all of the usage of these tools on a MBR disk, it's not going to work if you want to have a dual boot, I guess. Unless you have a second hard disk in your desktop, then it might work. But are there any other questions? Or are things silent now? I see you're nothing on the YouTube channel or on IRC.
Yeah, I don't see anything else coming in here.
Okay. Well, Alex, thank you for logging in and giving us some insight where we are on UEFI. Still a way to go with GPT, I guess, but this UEFI stuff is beyond impressive. So okay.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the developer who worked on this, because he's done an incredible job. But in any case, I think I'll be back later this evening, so for something else.
Okay, see you later. Okay. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Bye-bye, Alex.
Take care, everyone.
We've just patched in Jan van Wijk. Most of you will actually know him. He's the pushing locomotive behind the DFC software, something that turned out as a project for OS2 only partition management, and now it's a, as he calls it himself, a Swiss Army knife for disk support, which works on GPT and MBR and supports a avalanche of file systems. And Jan has been so kind to put together a presentation and to bring you guys up to speed what DFC is doing. Most of you guys are probably also familiar with DFC, as in some cases it's very handy to do file recovery, disaster recovery, and make backups. As I said, it's a Swiss Army knife. Okay, Jan, the stage is yours, as they say in the showbiz. So, Jeroen, can you flick the switch over?
Okay, hello everybody. This is Jan van Wijk from Studio Almere, little home studio. Okay, we're going to do a short presentation on DFC version 16 and some maybe some demoing, but probably just a lot of Q&A at the end. I'll just tell you a little bit about the latest stuff, new features that have been introduced since version 9 or 10 or so, and then you're seeing the first slide now, opening slide, so you can go on to the next slide, which briefly shows all of you who I am. So I'm a software engineer, been working for lots of years in big banking environments. The last couple of years I've been, the last 20 years actually, I've been developing DFC, my own company, developing the software, providing support, stuff like that. Next slide, please. There we go to DFC itself. What is DFC? It's a disk utility, works on multiple operating systems. You can work on OS2, of course. That's how I started with the DFC program, because I needed that for my work at the time with one of those big banks. And there was not very much available for OS2 in disk utilities at that point. But as we are now version 16, there are 4 different operating systems supported, or actually 5. It works on OS2, works on Windows, works on Mac OS, works on DOS, and it works on Linux. And it's comparable to functionality of other programs like Partition Magic, Drive Image, Norton Utility, stuff like that. And the things we do with DFC, we can do with DFC, is just partitioning disks, solve problems if there are any. You can clone disks. If you put a bigger disk in your laptop or PC, you can use DFC to clone the complete contents of one disk to a new one, and then continue with that. You can use it as a backup thing using imaging. You can actually, even if you make an image backup from partitions, you can actually get individual files and stuff from it. So you can use it as a backup mechanism. And you can do low-level disk analysis, fixing stuff like that. Next slide, please. Okay, talking about partitioning. DFC can manage partitioning information. It can create partitions, delete them. You can also make a backup of all your partitioning stuff. So that's not backing up any data in your partitions, but just the partitioning information, whether it's MBR partitioning or UEFI, GPT partitioning, doesn't matter. It will back up all the specific sectors that are being used for partitioning. And there's also a few procedures that are related to that. It's called DFS disk or DFS fast procedures that will analyze the partitioning information. And it's actually used a lot in preparing disk recovery. So if you got any lost partitions or the other strange things happening with your disk system and you'd like support from DFC, the DFS disk or DFS fast procedures, which are available from the DFC menu, is often the best way to start, because it will give me a very good overview of your disks and your partitioning and possible problems with the disk. Okay, sure. It's better? Okay. If it's still a problem, I'll just put on my headphones. Okay. About this disk recovery, which is one of the most used features in DFC, I guess, apart from just partitioning. The procedure usually is that people email me with problems, and I then ask them to run a DFS disk procedure or DFS fast procedure, which will generate up to 7 files with the disk information that's emailed back to me, and then I can usually analyze the problem and probably come up with recovery steps for the person to carry out, or sometimes a recovery script that is automating a recovery, which I can also test in a virtual environment at my PC over here, and then send back to the customer to repair the problems on his disk. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and the next thing is the simple creation and deletion of partitions. This is what you do when you install new operating systems, or when you have new disks and you need new data partitions or boot partitions. You can create MBR partitions or GPT partitions if you got a modern system, which is not completely supported by OS2 yet, as Alex just explained in the previous presentation. But that's being worked on. It also has a full support for the OS2 LVM environment, which is based on the MBR partitioning scheme, and it can set all the LVM information required and also update it, so giving changing partition names, disk names, stuff like that. Also correct disk size. For instance, if you have cloned a disk from a smaller disk to a larger one, then what you'll probably notice is that although Windows or Linux or other operating systems see the new disk size immediately, OS2 needs another update for the LVM information, because that actually records the size of the disk being used, so that needs to be updated. And there's also provisions in DFC to do that. You can also, if you're more familiar with disk partitioning, you can use low-level tools in DFC, like the partition table editor, to directly manipulate GPT tables or MBR tables. But that's usually not required for just managing your disk and partitions, but it's available if you want to. And there's also some related commands in the DFC fdisk module that have various fixes or things to set specific stuff. And most of those commands are also available through the menu system. Next slide, please. Okay, then there's two related things, imaging and cloning. First talk about imaging a little bit. Imaging is a process where you copy on a low level all sectors from a partition, a disk partition, or perhaps a whole disk, or maybe just part of a partition or a disk, and write that to a file. So just a regular file in your file system. You can use that as a backup, so you can just at the later point just restore that completely. You can also compress this disk image so that the actual file you're creating is a lot smaller than the complete contents on your partition, so it saves a little bit space. And you can actually access those images as well from DFC and retrieve a single file from them. So if you use DFC imaging as a backup mechanism, you can also access those backups to just get a single file out of there without having to restore the complete backup to your partition. Okay, then there's another mechanism. So imaging is between the disk or partitions and regular files. And those files could be transferred through external USB disk or through email or whatever. So you can transfer them easily to another system as well. There's another mechanism, it's called cloning, and it's similar, but what it will do is it will copy those partition sectors or disk sectors directly from one disk to another, or from one partition to another. So it's faster because it doesn't have the intermediate step of writing and reading files. But unless you're using a network, you're limited to copying between disks in the same system. Okay, and just like imaging, you can also use smart technology and compression, which will make sure that only the sectors that are actually in use on the disk or in the partition will be copied over. So if you've got a huge gigabyte partition and only a few hundred megabytes are used, only those few hundred megabytes will be copied. When is it used? It's basically two areas. Some people use it, the cloning, to have backups of complete partitions that they can easily restore at any point. So as a sort of checkpoint. So if you've got a stable system, you say, okay, this is the way I like my operating system. You can make a clone to a different backup partition. And at any point in time where if you screwed up your system, you can just copy it back and it will be back at the working system again. The other is cloning disks. If you upgrade your system to larger disks, then you can just make a complete disk-to-disk copy and work with a new disk. As said, maybe after also updating the LVM information to make sure OS2 also knows about the new disk size. Oh, there's one thing to mention. If you're using Linux and ext4 bootable, the smart technology in DFC may not always work correctly because there seem to be some undocumented sectors being used by the grub boot manager in Linux. And I'm still investigating that, but so if you have bootable ext4 file systems on Linux, then turn off the smart feature in DFC if you're cloning or imaging. Next slide, please. Okay, another area of functionality that's being used more and more, at least I use it a lot, file recovery and delete. File recovery is a mechanism where DFC will look at raw sectors in a partition or a disk for a file system at the low level, so you don't need the operating system support for the specific operating system. Just access to the raw sectors, and DFC will interpret the file system and present you with a list of files, more or less, in a browser kind of environment. And you can view those files or copy them to somewhere else, which is very useful for several things. One of them is pure file recovery. So if a partition is damaged to some extent or not accessible for other reasons, for instance, because you want to have a file from an NTFS file system while running OS2, and NTFS file systems are not accessible from OS2, then you can use DFC to find that file on the NTFS partition and copy it to one of your OS2 partitions. You can also use it to retrieve files from an image backup that you made, for example, as I mentioned before with imaging. And you can also use it on some of the file systems as a form of undelete. So if you deleted the file, On some operating systems, it's possible to find back the deleted file name and copy the file information to another place. So effectively undeleting the file. Okay, this in the latest versions, starting with version 13 or 14, I think, this file recovery has been integrated in a new user interface called the file browser, which is a much more user-friendly interface to the file recovery mechanism, actually. It looks a lot like a normal file manager working with that. Okay, next slide, please. And the next slide is about the directory and file browsing. This is so a display navigation on directory and files, just like things like the Windows Explorer or the OS/2 Workplace Shell. Navigation of your file system with a window that shows your directories on one side and files in those directories on the other side. You can actually select files there and use the context menu to do various operations like viewing them or copying them, or low-level editing them, stuff. As mentioned on the slide. You can also view some internal stuff of specific file systems, like, for instance, OS/2 extended attributes or NTFS stuff, or stuff on ext file systems, for instance. Next slide, please. One of the things available from the browser, but also available in many other places in DFC, is a low-level hex editor, where you can do binary editing and viewing using a display that shows the contents of sectors or larger areas of the disk in both hexadecimal and ASCII representations, like people are used to in debuggers and stuff like that, and also other disk tools like Norton Utilities. You can use it to directly access your disk at a low level, and in that way manipulate or just analyze your partition tables or bootloaders or file systems, whatever. It does require a lot of knowledge, of course, about what you're looking at. So it's not for it's not a beginner tool, but it will give you complete control, not just viewing, but also editing the contents of most of your disk contents. It also has a few viewing modes where you can look at contents of sectors or a sequence of sectors as pure ASCII. So if it's text files, you can switch to that mode and just read it more easily. Or you can view it as code if you're looking at program files or bootloaders or stuff like that. Even a boot sector, you can display it as a disassembly view and look at the actual code that's in those sectors. Okay, next slide, please. Hope we're still in sync. We're at the enhanced native scripting page now. Scripting was something introduced very early in DFC as a very simple mechanism of executing one or more DFC commands from a text file, which would be useful and has been used a lot to do automated partitioning and stuff like that. However, it lacked a lot of features because it was very hard to provide feedback from the scripting you're doing, and there was no real good way to check for errors and stuff like that. So at a certain point in version 9 or 10, I introduced enhanced scripting, which is more of a programming language. It looks a little bit like Rex, a little bit like some other program languages. And it will allow you to execute DFC commands and embed those in control structures like if statements and while statements and stuff like that. And it also allows the script and the commands in there to test for return code. So if you do an imaging or a cloning or editing a sector or execute any other DFC command, the script can check if that command was successful and act accordingly, either continuing with the next step or maybe provide you with an error message or something like that. So this makes it a lot easier to make more complex recovery scripts or make partitioning scripts that are more intelligent than just putting a few DFC commands in a sequential script. And there are actually a few standard scripts that come with DFC that do stuff like that, so which are located in the scripts menu. You can find them there. Next script, next slide, please. Okay, then this is more of a general introduction of some of the features in DFC. I'll just quickly go over the versions now. I won't be reading all the slides verbatim, but I'll just mention some of the stuff. As said before, DFC is available for several operating systems, 5 of them at the moment. It's non-graphical, so the interface is what a lot of people still call DOS mode, which is actually just a textual interface. But the mechanism that you work with is based on windowing, so there are pop-up windows, menus, stuff like that, and you can operate the user interface either with a keyboard or with a mouse. And most of the functions used by the regular customers will be available through the menu, which makes it a lot easier to use. And there's also an integrated help system, which will give you some more background on what the menu items will do. One important thing is also that you can log all your output, so everything that's been shown on the screen in DFC in the background, so the commands being used and the output of those commands, you can route those to a log file automatically. And that's very useful because you can email those log files to me or someone else for further analysis. And of course, there's command scripting, like mentioned in the previous slide. Okay, next slide, please. This is a small overview of all the versions. As you can see, I already started version 1 in 1994, so over 25 years ago. And that was because we started with OS2 then with a large bank, and there were really no disk utility. So if anything was wrong with the disk, you were really going blind. So I created a small tool to be able to view those HPFS structures on the disk, which was possible because one of the implementers, the main implementer with IBM of OS2 HPFS, Doug Azzurito, actually gave a presentation on that on Colorado OS2 in the US, which I attended, and that gave me enough information to be able to build my own tool to view those HPFS structures. And that's how it all started. And in those 25 years, I went from version 1 to version 16. And starting with version 4, I think, it was actually available on the internet as a commercial version. So it was using a licensing scheme. And it was a paid version. Before that, it was free. And before version 3 or 2, I think it was only IBM internal only. It was not available on the internet. But the last versions are all being made available through my website for sale. You can download the version and start using it. But for serious and continued use, you'll need to buy a license in one of the web shops, either Menzies or ArcaOS, which sell those licenses. Okay, next slide, please. I'll quickly go over some of the features introduced in the older versions, starting with version 9. One of the things introduced there was contents-based disk geometry, because one of the problems we often encounter with, or I often encounter with DFC working with customers, is that it's difficult to always get the right disk geometry, because different operating systems may use different geometries, and that will might give you various problems if you're creating something new, not using the correct disk geometry. So I implemented some logic to analyze disks and come up with usually the best geometry to be used on that particular disk. Okay, then also in those versions there was more support for Linux file systems like ext, and Riser FS, and also the grub boot manager, so more Linux support. The enhanced scripting was introduced in those versions, disassembler. And also, which was a nice addition, until then DFC was available as a program that ran from your hard disk on DOS or OS2 or Windows. And there was also a bootable CD-ROM that ran the DOS version of DFC. And with version 9, I introduced a bootable USB stick that contained a Linux-based bootloader that could boot either into FreeDOS or into Linux, and so you could run DFC booted from a USB stick when supported by your hardware. And also the first GPT partitioning, so that's the one being used with the UEFI systems, was added to DFC, but at that point it was display only, so you could only view those tables and not manipulate them yet. Next slide, please. Well, I don't need to tell a lot about that. This was the opening screen of that first generation DFC USB boot disk, where you could choose between FreeDOS and Linux. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm skipping a few pages here in my printout. Okay, versions 12 and 13. Version 12 introduced a new concept in the user interface, because I got a lot of complaints from especially beginners that the user interface in DFC was quite overwhelming, because there was lots of commands, lots of menu items, and usually people that just start using DFC quickly get lost in all the possibilities. So I introduced a new basic operating mode, and actually DFC will normally start up in that basic mode, where you will have most of the things that you may need on a daily basis will be available, but there will be less clutter of menu items and commands that are used not so much. So you would only see the basic functionality and not be overwhelmed by all the extra possibilities. And you can easily switch between them using one of the menu items, or actually click on the menu bar somewhere. There's a thing, if you click on the basic or the expert indicator in the menu bar, then it will actually switch over. I also introduced the search and grab possibilities to search through your screen output, and also search through your help system. So if you need to find something about HPFS, for instance, you can look through all the help files and find all the parts that mention the HPFS file system. Or go back in your search back in your log output that was on the screen to find certain phrases or words, whatever. And also, I think in version 13 or maybe 12, there was support for a new file system called exFAT by Microsoft. I didn't call it that way in DFC because of licensing and issues that might pop up, because it's a proprietary file system. But the support is there, so if you got new large memory sticks or maybe memory cards from a camera or something, they might use exFAT, and you will be able to work on those using DFC. And also the support for the ext file system on Linux was enhanced at that point to include the functionality to browse files and copy files, recover stuff. So the support for the ext file systems from that point on was the same level as it already was for NTFS and HPFS and FAT file systems. And also in version 13, I think, complete support for GPT. So from that point on, you were able to create and delete partitions in GPT using commands or using a GPT specific version of the partition table editor. So you could manipulate GPT partitionings in the same way you could MBR before. Next slide, please. Okay, then we go on to version 14. Version 14 introduced the browsing user interface, which actually builds on existing functionality in DFC to be able to create lists of file names and directories and stuff like that with the associated information. But it presents them in a way that looks a lot like a file manager, like a file commander or many of the other file managers that are in use. Of course, it's still text-based, but it gives you a list of files with some of the information like the size and the date and time information. And you can scroll through those files, you can mark files, you can use a context menu to copy them or view them or whatever. So this makes it a lot easier for people to find files in a file system and to recover or copy them elsewhere or just view them. Then there was another addition in that it was made possible to access complete file systems or files, and also so directories in the files using the browser, not from a disk or a partition, but from a backup made by DFC to an image file. So if you create an image file in DFC, usually with a file extension IMZ for compressed image file, it's now possible to open that in DFC using the file menu and open it just as if it was a partition on the disk or a file system on the disk. And you can recover and copy files from that, which is very useful functionality. And you can do the same from a virtual disk as used by VirtualBox, so called VDI files. So if you're using VirtualBox to run other operating systems like Linux or Windows or whatever on OS2 or the other way around, you can directly access those raw disk files, the VDI files, with DFC to copy files out of that, without the need to start a virtual machine to do the same. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, DFC version 15. Okay, there were a lot of enhancements made to the user interface, all little things, but making it easier to use. Had been collecting a lot of hints and tips by users and other developers, things that could be improved. And version 15, I made a real effort to make sure most of the complaints about the user interface were addressed. So that made DFC easier to use, especially for beginners and people used to graphical environments like Linux and Windows, because a lot of the same principles in using the mouse and whatever also started to work within DFC. Also, the browse functionality was updated a little bit to make it possible to copy in one step a complete directory with all subdirectories. So if you got a For instance, you got if you are working on an NTFS file system on your Windows computer and you would like to copy the whole home directory for the user or the whole My Documents folder, you can just find that in DFC and just say, okay, copy this whole directory, this whole folder to another disk to recover that without having to find and select all the files individually. And also this version introduced some more Mac-based functionality with the support for the HFS Plus file system that was used, and also some limited HPFS file system support, which is a new file system by Apple that's being used on the latest 2 or 3 incarnations of macOS, and it's being used more and more. And there's also a Mac DFC.app, so it's an app you can actually put on the docking station in macOS, so you can easily start it from the graphical user interface. Okay, and then the version 15 also introduced the next generation of the DFC USB stick, a bootable stick, which was a lot more useful than the previous one because the Linux being started is more powerful. It's much easier to get internet access from that. It's much easier to connect more external USB disks, for example, especially compared to the previous stick using FreeDOS. But it's also better than the Linux that was available on the first generation. Because if you boot it, you'll get a fully functional Linux desktop that includes even things like desktop processing, like a word processor and stuff like that, but also a good browser. You can go to the internet, you can use email if you want, you can connect more disks if you want to copy files, make backups and stuff like that. And also it can use, DFC can access, of course, the file systems on the external disk, so it's easy to store images or analysis files on the same stick you're booted from or on other external USB disks. So this made recovery and booting stuff on non-functional systems a lot easier. Next slide, please. Version 16, which is actually the current major version. I think the first 16.0 was early last year, I think. So it's a little over a year old now, and the actual version is 16.6 with 16.7 with a few small bug fixes and enhancements coming up in a couple of weeks. And 16 introduced even more enhancements to user interface, more updates to the browser, and full support for the APFS file system now for the macOS. And also support for the CD-ROM file system, ISO, which is sometimes handy if you want to access an ISO file, maybe for an operating system installation or something else. You can open an ISO file from DFC and copy files from that, or just look at it without needing any other special tools. And version 16 also brought the third generation of the USB boot stick with newer versions of the Puppy Linux, making it more powerful, and also direct access. If you boot, even without using DFC, if you boot the stick, you can also directly access NTFS file systems and GFS file systems from the Linux that's booted from the stick. But of course, DFC is included and is available directly from the desktop, so you can use that quite easily. And there are a few versions available to cater for different hardware. So there's a 64-bit version that runs actually on most modern hardware, but there's also still 32-bit if you got old hardware that doesn't have 64-bit support. And also the original one is still available for download as well. All of those sticks can be created from DFC itself in a reasonably simple way. There are a few menu items to create a bootable USB stick using an image file which can be downloaded from the DFC website, but the downloading is also automated from within DFC, as long as DFC has access to the wget utility to download stuff. Okay, next slide. Which is just the Linux desktop that you get if you boot one of those latest sticks, and you'll see DFC running on there. There's a nice image from the actual DFC sticks as the physical stick as being shipped from the web shop, the Mince's web shop. And that's the final slide in the presentation apart from the next one. Next slide, which is starting the Q&A. So if there are any questions, I hope I will see through my Skype session somewhere, because of course I don't hear any one of you, but you should be able to put questions in through the message board, I think. Oh, I see some comments already. Martin, cool guitars, yeah. It's a Strat hanging there, and there's a Les Paul standing behind me as well.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'll just scroll back a little bit in my chat, because I think there's a few questions in there.
I'm looking at the IRC chat. There are no questions in there currently, and I see on the I see people like your guitars that are hanging on the wall, but there are no questions about DFC, it seems.
Okay. Yeah, well, what you actually see in the back, let's see. I'm not sure if you can see it. This is my little home recording studio that I'm building at the moment for guitar and maybe some vocals at some point, whatever. Okay, let's scroll back through the chat. I think I saw some questions there.
Ah, yeah.
And it's all about the UEFI that was still for Alex.
No, Martin is asking, in some Warpstock you told me you were experimenting with Qt development to make some DFC user interface common for several OSs. Did you manage to move forward on that? Or are you planning on using to use some Qt for DFC?
Okay, I just put on my headphones and I can have some more volume that I can hear a little bit better. Okay, still, I guess you still hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, the question I think was about the possible graphical user interface for DFC that I mentioned a few times in the past. That's still in the concept stadium, and I'll be using the new version 5 of what's it called?
Qt.
Yeah, Qt, right. Qt 5, which is more or less ready, I think, by now. And it's possible that I'll start working on that this year. But there have been a few major changes in my personal life the last year. So for the last half year, I have not been spending too much time on DFC apart from support and maintenance. But that may change in the course of this year. So it is one of the things I do consider as one of the new features for upcoming versions. So to have a full graphical version, making it even easier for most people to use DFC. On the other hand, it is a lot of work, and it doesn't actually introduce new contents, new functionality in DFC. It's just a different user interface. So I'm still a bit considering, should I do it or shouldn't I? It'll probably depend a little bit on user feedback as well. I may attract new users when I got a graphical user interface, or I may not. I'm not sure.
I guess something like a bit in the direction of what partition magic used to look like. Something in that, with a graphical representation of your disk layout in a
Yes.
bar with what partitions are in there and what types, etc.
Possibly, yeah. It might look a little bit like that. So in the first incarnation, it will probably look a lot like the text version of DFC, but then in a graphical environment. But of course, because you do have the graphical environment with more powerful graphical interfaces available, it's possible to make a lot easier interfaces to certain things, like resizing partitions or placing stuff, or you can do that much more easily in a good graphical environment than you can in a textual environment. So the interface would probably enhance over time. True. Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, Alex had a question about LAN drives. I'm trying to scroll back here through the IRC chat. Is there anything else here? Oh, and you'll be getting, this is on the YouTube channel. Mark Dodell will be contacting you about a NAS drive that was corrupted. I had the USB DFC stick running on a thing. It broke my arm, so put it aside for you. Okay, anyway, he'll contact you about a corrupted disk, it seems.
That was Mark Dodell?
Yeah, he wrote
Okay,
that. He wrote that on the YouTube video chat. In the meantime, I'm scrolling back through the.
Oh, yeah, I see it. Yeah, I got that. I got it on a different laptop as well. I'm looking at the YouTube now.
Okay.
Okay, I will be contacting you about my NAS drives that were corrupted. Okay, that's fine, Mark.
Alex is asking regarding imaging. You can't image to a LAN drive. Is that right? Why wouldn't you be able?
Well,
because it's a drive letter, so.
That sometimes seems to be a problem on Windows systems, that for some reasons the drive letters that are available that are created on the network, on the local area network, are not visible from DFC for some reason. I have not been able to duplicate that on my own system yet.
Actually, what Alex is writing here on the IRC chat is that I was looking at doing backups on my Win systems to my NAS using DFC for imaging. I couldn't either get Windows or OS2 versions to write to the LAN shares.
Okay, yeah, that seems to be a problem. I have not been able to, I don't have a NAS myself, so I've been testing this with regular drive mappings, and that usually works for me. But I have had other reports from users that they were not able to use the network. I have no idea why it doesn't work.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I'm looking here on the YouTube channel and I'm looking on the IRC channel. As I said previously, I'll give it about a 20 to 30 seconds delay, since it takes time for the video stream to get through to people.
Yeah, it's a bit comical seeing myself talk about 30 seconds later on the screen before me.
Now that's deja vu. Now, as Arnold van Overheem writes, he says, any plans around supporting RAID 5 configurations? I think the answer to that is probably no, because RAID 5 can be very different.
Well, there's no direct support because the way DFC operates, there's another presentation on that which is on my website. The way DFC operates is it takes the lowest level interface that the operating system has to access disks, but the RAID 5 system is below that level, so either hardware RAID or software RAID doesn't really matter, but at some point it will construct a normal disk view from the RAID areas on the disk and present that to the operating system, and that's the level that DFC works on. So from DFC you'll never see the lower intrinsic details of RAID. So it's supported in the sense that if you got a RAID system and your operating system can access it, then DFC can access it as well. But DFC is not a tool that you can use to fix RAID systems that are broken and that the operating system or the RAID controller itself cannot get to anymore. So if that's the case, then DFC cannot get to it either, because it doesn't have the real low level access to the RAID disks. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, it seems that there is this is turning into a popular request for you. Implemented DJ. Yeah, here also HDRW on YouTube says I have the same problem of LAN drive with drive letters not being able to image.
Okay, so this is something I should look into.
Yeah. And by the way, as some additional information, I don't know if it's useful for you, but well, Lewis reports that he can actually, I can say that the connections work under NetWare. So he maps a network drive with the IPX client under OS2, and that works. But Alex says that under Windows, just like you mentioned, he can't see the Samba shares under Windows in DFC. But under OS2 he can see them, and then the imaging to the network share hangs after a few seconds.
Okay, well, that might on Windows it might be something with user rights or something, right access. I'm not sure. I will do some testing on that. I have been testing it in the past, but that was a couple of years back. And on my system here, Windows, it did work. So I'll do some more testing on that. If there's anyone listening now that has those problems, please send me some email with more details if possible, and I can see if I can recreate the problems. And I may also get myself a NAS in the future, so I'll be able to test with that as well. And it will also be nice to have one more backup of all my stuff around here. So I'll look into the network accessibility from DFC.
There you go, free marketing provided by Warpstock. New feature request.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, we'll just put the egg timer again to 30 seconds. We did get a few questions, so anybody else?
Okay, you're welcome, Arnold. I see you. Thanks, Meet. Does that rate limitation apply to RAID 1?
Yes.
Well,
doesn't it?
It depends a little bit. If you got a RAID 1 system and if it's a software RAID, then it's possible that the operating system also allows access to the individual disks. So then you could access those disks with the DFC, or you could take the individual disk from a RAID 1, which is just mirroring, so it's two disks with the same contents. You could just put one of those disks in an external enclosure perhaps, and then access it with DFC. So in that sense, yeah, it would be supported. And it may also be possible, if they're still connected to a system, that you can either access the RAID constructed disk view by the operating system and also the individual disks, but it depends on the operating system and the way the RAID is implemented. But since it's mirroring, the two disks will be identical, and if you take them out of the disk, the RAID disk configuration, and put them in another computer or in an external enclosure, you should also be able to access the file systems on that disk with DFC.
Okay. I just keep turning my head around to see if there are other questions popping up, but I think they have kind of dried up for now.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry we can't give you a real round of applause, but same thing goes for Alex. So it's the sound of silence this time. So
I can imagine it. Yeah.
I hope that we can meet each other all again in Germany next year, depending on how it goes. So
yes, either the next year in Germany or maybe later this year in the US. Not sure if that will be held or not. I don't think it's been decided yet.
No, I've heard some rumors, but maybe Lewis can answer that.
Okay.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Okay. Jan, thank you for your time, and thank you for your great tool. You've saved a lot of OS2 users their data, I think, over the years that didn't have an appropriate backup.
Okay, you're very welcome. Thanks all for listening, and maybe see you in next year or maybe in the US on the next Warpstock.
Okay, and thank you for your time.
Bye.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.